Ever catch yourself, like, I don't know, wishing you could just plug in and supercharge your brain?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Well, that's what we're going to dig into today, DIY brain stimulation. We're talking about those at-home devices, the ones that promise to zap your brain into a better state, whether you're dealing with, like, anxiety, depression, or even hoping for a cognitive boost.
Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. People are really fascinated by this idea of taking control of their own brain activity, especially without relying on medication. It's like a new frontier.
Right. And we've got this article that dives headfirst into this whole trend. It's
Mm.
got stories of people using these devices for all sorts of things, even like Alzheimer's, which is kind of mind blowing. But it all boils down to this. Does it actually work, or is it all just hype?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Totally. So, like, for those of us who aren't neuroscientists, what exactly are we talking about here? What is this tech and how is it supposed to work?
So the big thing is something called tDCS, which stands for transcranial direct current stimulation. Basically, it involves applying these super weak electrical currents to specific parts of your brain.
Okay, so it's like sending tiny little jolts to nudge your neurons in the right direction.
Exactly. And the goal is to influence brain activity,
Yeah.
potentially making it more or less active depending on what you're aiming for.
Interesting. But, like, how do we know if it actually does anything?
Well, that's where the research comes in.
Yeah.
And one study this article talks about really caught my eye. They were looking at tDCS for people struggling with depression, and get this, they found practically zero difference between the treatment and a placebo.
Whoa, seriously. So it was all just in their heads.
Well, not necessarily. See, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So this study just shows how crucial it is to have those rock-solid, placebo-controlled trials. Just because this one study didn't show a huge effect doesn't mean tDCS is a bust. There are other studies out there, some with really promising results.
Like, what? Give me some hope here.
Okay, so there's this one study. They were looking at tDCS as a treatment for PTSD, specifically in patients who weren't responding well to traditional therapies. And the results were actually kind of amazing.
Okay, now we're talking. What were they seeing?
They found that tDCS seemed to shift the brainwave patterns in these patients, making them look a lot more like the brainwaves of people without PTSD.
So it was actually rewiring their brain activity.
Kind of, yeah. It seemed to be influencing the neural activity related to those PTSD symptoms. It's like it was helping their brains process trauma differently.
Wow. Okay, that's seriously impressive. You mentioned earlier about studies with Alzheimer's, too. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so there have been a handful of small studies looking at that, and some suggest there might be some benefits for Alzheimer's patients, but like we were talking about before, it's still super early days.
Right. Got to be cautious with those early findings.
Absolutely. One of the studies, though, they found that when they paired tDCS with cognitive training, some patients actually showed improvements in, like, memory and overall cognitive function.
Okay, that's really promising. But instead, more research is needed.
Yeah, we definitely need larger, more robust studies to really confirm if those benefits hold up over time.
Makes sense. It seems like every time we uncover something new in this field, it just leads to more questions.
Totally. It's like opening one door just reveals a whole hallway of other doors.
Uh-huh, exactly. So, with all this potential, all these possibilities, what's the deal with these at-home devices?
Right. Well, that's where things get a little interesting, to say the least.
How so?
Well, you can actually find a ton of these devices online, like a whole bunch of them. They promise all sorts of things, from making you super focused to giving you the best sleep ever.
Really? So, like, I could just go online right now and order something that claims to boost my brain power.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's part of what makes this whole thing so fascinating, but also a little, I don't know, concerning maybe.
Concerning how?
Well, here's the thing. The FDA hasn't actually given the green light to any of these devices for at-home use.
Wait, seriously? Not a single one?
Nope, not yet.
Wow. Okay, so how are they even allowed to sell them then?
Well, a couple have gotten what's called breakthrough device designation. It basically means the FDA sees some potential there, so they're putting them on a faster track for review, but it's definitely not a guarantee that they'll get approved.
So it's like a proceed with caution situation.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, most of these devices aren't even being marketed specifically as medical devices. So that puts them in kind of a regulatory gray area.
So no official stamp of approval from the people who are supposed to be looking out for us, yet we've got all these companies selling these brain-zapping gadgets left and right, and people are actually buying them.
Yeah, it's a wild west out there. And there are definitely some risks involved, especially if you're, not using them responsibly.
Okay, so let's talk about those risks. What are we talking about here? But before we do, I think it's important to acknowledge the placebo effect.
Oh, absolutely. That's huge here.
Because even if these devices aren't actually doing anything directly to our brains, just the belief that they are could lead to real changes,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Our minds are incredibly powerful. When we believe something is going to help us, often it does, at least to some extent. We see it all the time with placebos and studies.
It's like tricking your brain into feeling better.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just about feeling better either. When people feel more empowered, more in control of their health, it can lead to other positive changes too. Like they might start eating better, exercising more, all because they feel more optimistic and motivated.
So it's this fascinating interplay of expectation, behavior, and potentially some genuine physiological effects. We're really just starting to scratch the surface of how it all works.
Totally. It's a super complex puzzle. And with the DIY brain stimulation thing, it really makes you think, Like, is this a sign of the times?
What do you mean?
Well, this whole idea of taking our health into our own hands, sometimes in ways that might seem a little, I don't know, unorthodox, makes you wonder, like, are people turning to these at-home solutions because they're not getting what they need from the traditional healthcare system?
That's a really good point. The article touched on that a bit. Like, if it was easier and more affordable for people to access quality mental health care, would they be so quick to try these at-home brain zapping devices?
Right. Like if we had a system where everyone had timely access to mental health professionals, affordable treatment options, would this whole DIY thing even be as much of a thing?
It's a really complex issue with so many layers. I mean, we know that long wait times, high costs, limited access to mental health professionals, that's the reality for so many people. So, yeah, it's understandable that some might gravitate towards these alternative solutions, even if there are a lot of unknowns.
Totally. And it just highlights how important it is for people to talk to their doctors about this stuff.
Right. Like, even if someone's dead set on trying at home brain stimulation, having that conversation with their doctor first is crucial.
Exactly. A doctor can help them weigh the risks, make sure it won't mess with any other treatments they're doing, and just keep an eye out for any weird side effects.
So, open communication with a healthcare provider is key. It's one thing to talk about potential benefits, but let's be real, we all want to know about the risks, right?
Absolutely, and it's a totally valid question. I think it's important to make a distinction between like those commercially available devices, the ones you find online, and then those DIY versions that some people try to build on their own.
Okay, yeah, those DIY ones sound a little sketchy.
Yeah, those are definitely a whole other level of risk. We're talking like potential burns, unpredictable energy output, really dangerous stuff. But with those commercially available ones, the risk of actual physical harm is pretty low as long as, and this is key, as long as they're used according to the instructions.
So follow the directions, people.
Exactly. Don't get any bright ideas to start messing with the settings or anything. Electrode placement is super important and obviously sticking to the recommended dosages. Going rogue with these devices is where things can get really risky.
It's like you wouldn't mess with the dosage on any other medical device, so why do people think it's okay to do that with something that's literally going on their brain?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just not worth the risk. And this reminds me of a story from that article we were talking about before. They mentioned patients who were using tDCS for cognitive enhancement, like
Yeah.
trying to boost their brain power, and they actually ended up experiencing mania.
Whoa, seriously?
Yeah, it just goes to show that even with these devices that seem relatively safe, there's always the potential for unexpected side effects, especially without any medical supervision.
Okay, that's a really good point. And it makes me think it's not just about the immediate physical risks, right?
Right, exactly.
There are all these other layers, like the potential long-term effects that we don't even know about yet, and of course, all the ethical questions that come with this kind of technology.
Oh, absolutely. The ethics of brain stimulation are huge.
Huge is an understatement. I mean, imagine a future where this technology becomes so advanced, so effective, that it's like readily available to everyone.
Right, like it becomes the norm.
Exactly. Do we end up in a world where people feel pressured to use it, like to keep up in school or get ahead in their careers?
It's like what was once a personal choice becomes something you almost have to do to stay competitive.
Right. And then what happens to the people who can't afford it or choose not to use it?
Right, they're at a disadvantage. It's like
Mm.
this whole new level of inequality. And we're not even talking about like The potential for coercion, like what if employers start requiring brain stimulation for certain jobs? It gets really complicated really fast.
It's like something out of a dystopian sci-fi movie.
Ah.
Brain stimulation as a tool for social control, widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Exactly. And it all comes down to, like, what are the limits of human enhancement? At what point do we start messing with the very essence of who we are?
It's a slippery slope. This has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to break all of this down for us.
Of course, it's been a pleasure. It's such an exciting and terrifying field all at the same time.
It really is. So we've got all this incredible potential to help people with things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, even Alzheimer's. But at the same time, we've got to proceed with caution. There's still so much we don't know about the brain and the long-term effects of tinkering with it.
No doubt, more research is essential.
Absolutely. And until we have those answers, it's up to each of us to be informed, to weigh the risks and benefits, and to have those important conversations with our healthcare providers.
Couldn't agree more.
So folks, if you're thinking about dabbling in the world of DIY brain stimulation, please do your research, be smart, and stay safe. And as always, keep those brains buzzing.